Here is part 2 of the gentleman's desk, when epoxy becomes a nightmare. In the last video, we showed you how we took this desk over here and turned it into this masterpiece. But in this video, I'm going to show you how we refinished the top and all the mistakes I ran into with epoxy so that you don't have to make the same mistakes I did. Now, this is going to be an in-depth tutorial, so if you just want to see the before and after of this desk, don't worry, it's coming. It's going to be much shorter. But this is if you are like me, you might have messed up somewhere along the way with epoxy and you need to know how to fix it. So first I'm going to show you how I prep this piece. When I first picked up this desk from Facebook Marketplace, it was $50 and everything was just really old, gouged, ripped, lots of holes in it. It needed to be repaired. This leather had to come up. I used a blow dryer, or you can use a heat gun, a putty knife, and some goof off to get all the residue off the top. I sanded it really good. I bondoed any areas of the veneer that had that particle board type of fuzzy underneath, sanded those down, got it as flat as I possibly could, and then I painted the top with a chalk-based paint by Dixie Belle. So here are the products that I tried to use at first. Epoxy resin by Kisrel, I found it on Amazon, Kilz Clear Binding Primer, and Shellac. If you're epoxying over any type of furniture at all, you need to make sure that everything's sealed in. And so I thought the Shellac and the Kilz primer would be able to do that for me, but you'll see why that was not the right step. I decided that I wanted to add a really cool feature to the top, which is a Bible page scripture inlay. Now, I did ask permission from a few pastors, my husband being one of them. Now, we have a few Bibles laying around the house, and I use the Bible that I grew up with. I asked my husband to pick out his favorite passages, and I also added mine in too, and I put them in coffee, so I let them sit. I dried them off, I put them on a drying rack, and I put them in the oven at 200 degrees for about 2 minutes each. I tested 2 of them just to make sure that this would work, but I loved how antique they looked. I used the clear bonding primer and scored out more pages that we weren't going to see that we're going to lay underneath so I could have 2 layers of scripture, and I put the top antique ones kind of around in kind of an array pattern. Now, just wait till you see what happens. It's so depressing. I spent so much time doing this, copying and baking the pages. I used that shellac, and I thought that that would seal everything in. What I read is if you're going to have anything in the epoxy, you really have to seal it down, especially pages, so that the liquid doesn't get underneath and discolor them. While this dried, I took my Best Dang Wax by Dixie Belle in brown and I went around all the edges. Now, I didn't seal in the chalk paint, and that was another mistake I made. So I figured I waxed the edges, I had the chalk paint ready to go, it looked really pretty, and I used chalk paint on the top instead of the satin enamel because the top just wasn't drying well with the humidity that we had in August. And so I thought this was all ready to go. Again, this kind of detail takes a long time, and unfortunately, I had to completely redo this. The day came that it was finally time for epoxy. I ordered this on Amazon. I was really excited. I knew how hard epoxy was. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't read the instructions and write them out for myself. I read the instructions, thought I knew what I was doing. I had timer set for exactly 4 minutes. I skipped the part where it said to set the thing aside before you poured it on for about 5 minutes. I just did it for 4, poured it on right away. But that wasn't the only mistake I made. The other mistake I made was I used all the stuff that came in their kit, which is a really good kit, but I should have used some extra plastic cups as you're pouring in your hardener and your epoxy resin. So you've got 2 different cups that you pour, one in your hardener, one in your resin. You're going to pour those 2 cups if they're the exact same amount. Now, I measured by height, so I didn't weigh them or anything. I poured them into these pouring containers, and that's where I stirred for 4 minutes. What I should have done was then I should have poured it after that into another clear container and then mixed that for maybe a few minutes more, or let it set in there after stirring it for another minute, and then poured it onto the table. The third mistake that I made was thinking that I could just do 1 layer. I've done epoxy before, and I've just had to do a thin layer over different acrylic pours that I've done, but furniture is an entirely other beast. And when you are filling in a space that's a little bit lower than the rest of it, it's going to make a difference, and it's going to be too thick. So I thought when I was looking at this, it didn't look too thick. It actually looked really good. I thought that it would dry perfect just like that, but it was actually too thick. I needed a seal coat first, especially on the inlay parts, and then another seal coat on the chalk painted parts before I even did a third coat. So don't put it on too thick, especially your first go. If you are left after 24 hours with sticky, tacky spots that are still soft, it has to be completely redone. I researched every which way that I didn't have to rip everything off, and I definitely cried a little bit, but it has to be pulled up because it wasn't mixed well enough. It is a complete science, and that's what I didn't do my research well enough at the get-go, but it has to be mixed well enough for the chemical reaction to take place for it to cure properly. So when I went to bed, this is how it looked. Absolutely gorgeous, perfection. I had done the butane torch a few more times just to get any last bubbles out, and it looked absolutely beautiful. But then I woke up in the morning. Everything that had poured over the edges didn't adhere to the edge, and so it was like there was hardly anything there. Everything in the middle just looked really swirly and squiggly, and there was a bunch of little holes where it didn't perfectly adhere. And then when I would press on certain pieces, it felt like the underneath was wet. And there were 2 soft spots that never cured. Everything in the research that I did showed that the underside, because it wasn't mixed well enough, the underside was heating up too much, and that was causing all the swirly stuff, and it needed to come completely off. I didn't film this because honestly, I was too upset. We used some wood chisels, some hammers, like pry bars to get this stuff up, especially the parts that had dried. And then I had to go with a sander and some goof off and re-shellacked it, the whole gamut. Knowing that I had to redo the Bible pages was probably the worst part because I just literally felt like lightning was going to come out of the sky and strike me down. I was able to get my husband's old Bible that he doesn't use anymore. It's the NASB version. It has a ton of stuff underlined. We picked out all of our favorite passages again, and I just laid them on straight. I didn't copy, I didn't antique them. I just wanted a straight up look just like this. After painting and doing the Bible pages with a polycrylic and a paintbrush, I sealed everything in with 3 coats of matte polycrylic. This time I went with the tried and true tested product of Total Boat epoxy resin. This stuff I know is fantastic. I just wanted to try Amazon's #1 brand that they had promoted, but I do know that Total Boat is used by many furniture finishers and woodworkers, and it is proven to be an incredible epoxy. So whether the other one was great and I just messed up the whole thing, who knows, but I didn't want to chance it again, so I went with Total Boat. You should try and say that 3 times fast. Now this time I got myself some big old cups. I did the inlays first, so I did 1 inlay at a time to make sure that it would completely cure and dry. This one had a cure time that was different. It had different mixing instructions, so make sure that you follow the instructions that comes with your epoxy resin. This needed to be mixed for 5 to 7 minutes about, and then it needed to be poured into another cup, which is so smart, and then mixed for another few minutes. And so I timed everything. I used the butane torch. I knew that I was going to plan on doing 3 layers. I did really thin layers. I sanded with my Surf Prep sander in between to get any of the divots out, and any sanding marks that you put in your epoxy resin totally goes away with your next layer. And before you epoxy again, you want to wipe everything with denatured alcohol, which is, it just says fuel on the can at Home Depot or Lowe's, and that gets everything out of the sanding marks that's any bit of dust. I used epoxy resin tape along the edges to try and create a barrier, but what it did was create what's called the meniscus effect, and as I'm spreading it out, it did spread up the wall a little bit, and I had to go around with a razor. So I figured out for the 3rd coat, I used silicone around the edges. That created more of a mess, like you can see here. As it was drying, I started peeling away the silicone, and then I had to go through after it was completely cured with a brush, steel brush, all sorts of stuff to try and pick this stuff off. After the 3rd layer, it looked like this, and I was really happy with it. My husband wouldn't let me do any more. It's not completely perfect, but he really needed his office back, and so I decided I was happy with it until he goes out of town again, and then I'm probably gonna do like 1 more big flood layer. But I went through and I fixed all these little details. I pulled all the silicone out that got stuck in my paint, and then I repainted all of the edges with that same enamel paint, and then I went through with the dark wax and I redid it all again. Now, the reason I was using a flat razor, like something that you would clean your glass top kitchen stove with, is that it got off the edges really well. And so using a hammer or just using just the slide technique, make sure you're not cutting into your epoxy on the top because you don't have another layer that's going on it to cover that up. But you want to get off those really sharp edges so that when someone's running their hand along it, they don't feel those. In total, I honestly think I painted this desk a few times. This could have been like 4 different pieces based on the amount of product that was put on, taken off, put on, stripped again. Overall, I'm really happy with it. Once we got it finished, we put all the stuff in it for him. He needed some cords run. It's a really cool, huge desk with really big drawers. I put all the handles on, and if you want to see the progress of what that looked like and the complete remake of the painting and the desk and refinishing it, you can go check out that first video. Stay tuned. I'm going to do a complete office renovation project where we did every single project, coming really soon. I want to know what you think about the color we chose, the style of this office, and if you would use a desk like this, and if you would ever try the epoxy pour over on furniture. Let me know in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed to my channel so that you don't miss any upcoming videos that I drop every week.